Thank you all for joining today's open learning session. It's fantastic to see so many people interested in this topic, growing with purpose. We're really looking forward to learning from Umbo's experience and your model of social enterprise that's focused on providing health services to rural and remote communities. My name is Athanasia from Social Enterprise Australia. We host these sessions as part of the Social Enterprise Development Initiative funded by the Federal Department of Social Services. The aim is to create a space for change makers and supporters right across the social enterprise community to share knowledge and experiences that will help strengthen the connection and the collaboration across the sector. Learning from each other, we know, is one of the most important things. So today's session is convened by Umbo. It's such a pleasure to be in the Zoom room with Francesca Pinzone, Jeannie McDonald, and Samantha McDonald. Thank you to all of you for your generosity and care, sharing your time and your experience. Before I hand over to you, Umbo crew, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands from which we're all joining today. I'm really thankful to be on beautiful Quandamooka country, which you can see in my background behind me. Pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging. I recognise their continuing connection to the waters, the skies, and the lands that we all have the privilege of living and working on. And I'm working hard myself to get more connected and learn more about this place where I'm living and working. I also pay respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participants. If you're joining today or listening after, recognise that your presence here holds over 65,000 years of systems thinking and relational care for people, for place, and for planet. So thank you. So now it's a pleasure to hand over to you, Francesca, to kick off this conversation.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Athanasia. Welcome. I'm really excited to be here today to present to you and really invite a conversation around talking through Umbo's journey around growing with purpose, but actually to hear a lot from our, social enterprise community, because it's been such an incredible, I guess, I hate the word journey, but an incredible journey to see what social enterprises can do to have great impact in different areas. And so I'd really, just want to kind of welcome you all today to talk about how can you build a scalable social enterprise that stays true to its mission. We're not going to be here and tell you all the answers that that we believe are the way forward. We're going to definitely talk about things that have not worked, but we're also going to talk about some of the things that have worked. And we're going to talk you through I guess the learnings that we have had in growing and building Umbo to be what it is. But firstly, I'd just really like to, welcome you. This is a beautiful artwork. I'm on Gadigal land. This is a beautiful artwork that was created by an Aboriginal artist in Sydney, and it represents a lot of Gadigal different areas around Gadigal land. So I do, really want to show that to you and just acknowledge. Thank you so much for that beautiful acknowledgement, but acknowledge. And I think the idea of systems change, we're all here for systems change, and what we can learn from our First Nations people around system change. As you said, they've been doing it thousands and thousands of years, and how can we learn from that? That's what's really important. So I'd love to ask a question of you. And can you raise your virtual hand if you've ever worried that scaling your enterprise might compromise your social mission? Because it's certainly a question that we have had at Umbo about how do you scale but hold true to the mission that you are trying to achieve? Because I think it's a really challenging tension that we can have, but it's also something that we need to talk about and talk about really openly. So I have some awesome team members and colleagues who are here with us today. I will allow them to provide a brief intro to kind of their background, but I've also got a question for Sam and Jeannie that I'd love them to answer, but I'm going to answer it myself first. So the question is, what drew you into working into a social enterprise? So my background is kind of in the health field, and I'd spent a lot of time doing overseas aid work. And when I came back to Australia, I started to kind of understand kind of how does the not-for-profit sector work? How do we kind of work within that charity space? I'd worked with Médecins Sans Frontières and also with UNICEF, and so very different kind of organisations. And when I came back to Australia, I was really trying to understand what that looked like in Australia. And then I worked in the not-for-profit space for quite a while, and I kept kind of this little niggling question was, but how do we know that what we're doing is actually having an impact and actually supporting people? So that's when I started to get really interested in social impact measurement. And so for me, I think the idea around kind of what has drawn me into this social enterprise work and building Umbo, we very purposefully built it as a social enterprise, was definitely around how can you use kind of business models, methods, all those types of things to actually build something for purpose and actually be able to scale something. And I'm going to talk a little bit about scale as we kind of go on, because for me, that is incredibly important. And so that's why I kind of liked this idea of, and we kind of tested it at the start, can you actually build a robust business that can have a great impact and be for purpose? So that's kind of what drew me in. So now I'm going to ask Jeannie to also answer that question and do a quick intro of herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. So thank you so much for having us. My name's Jeannie McDonald, and I'm the Clinical Services Manager at Umbo. And I actually came to Umbo more for a lifestyle choice than a social enterprise choice. So I'm a speech pathologist, and 4.5 years ago, I joined Umbo as a speechy. And it was a point of transition in my family's life where I needed to be around a little bit more. And Umbo seemed to really fit that brief. And it was an added bonus for me that it was a social enterprise. I have a sort of quite a personal connection to it because I grew up in regional Australia and still have friends living in regional Australia that have that everyday impact of how difficult it is to access healthcare, including allied health services. So that really drew me in. And once I arrived, I absolutely loved the social mission and was thrilled that I was in a business that actually was working as a really robust business, but still providing fantastic support to regional and remote Australians and fulfilling their social mission. So that's how I came here. I'll hand over to Sam.
Thanks, Jeannie. So my name's Sam. I'm the finance manager at Umbo. I've been here about 6 months now. So my background, I've been an accountant for a very long time. I've worked in quite a few different types of organisations. For me, it's really critical working somewhere where I love what we do. It can't be any of the counting widgets for me. And it's got to be something where I'm really proud to tell my friends where I work. And I'm proud to say what the organisation I work for is doing for importance for our community. So yeah, I would say it's not necessarily a social enterprise that drew me there, but those feelings behind it. But another thing that's always really important to me is working for a really solid company. A company that financially is someone that I want to be attached to. And it's quite integral for me that the organization I work at is very strong governance, and doesn't cause me too many difficulties to work there.
You can sleep at night.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks, Jeannie, for that. I think we're all attracted our purpose. I heard an incredible quote yesterday that said, "How can our role align with our soul?" And I thought that was a beautiful kind of quote that, I mean, it might be a bit too far, but for me, it's always been kind of that type of work that has drawn me in. So I really love that. So in terms of how we built Umbo and built it for purpose, I would just talk you briefly the background, because I think one of the key things that's super important in developing and growing a social enterprise is the meeting of an unmet need. And when I really reflect on how Umbo has been able to scale and to grow and to support so many people, it is that need is so important and it is high. And how do we solve the problem? And so for us, it was looking at the failure in the market. So the Umbo delivers allied health services to people in regional and rural Australia. And you can see here in this graph with the image of Australia, these are the gaps in NDIS provision specifically around Australia. And so there are such high gaps in that central regional kind of part of Australia. And because we are so dispersed, it can be really hard to deliver healthcare services. So when we first started Umbo, not only did we know that those communities were being underserviced, but the services that they may actually have will often fly in, fly out every 6, 12, 8, however long. It took a long time for people to get services that were quite inconsistent as well. And so we had discussed, how do we bridge this gap that exists, and what is the type of way that we can do it? And so back in 2017, nobody thought online therapy had any benefit. And so we were a little bit innovative, a little bit kind of early adopters. Obviously, COVID changed everything for Umbo and for many, many people, not just in terms of being able to access services, but being able to kind of open communities up as well. But I think the key thing was, how did we find that unmet need that was so prevalent? And this other particular graph with the people on it tells you that in remote areas, only 36% of people actually who have an NDIS budget can actually spend any money on it. So this is the problem with the provision of what exists at the moment. So we had that unmet need, we had a market failure, we had this idea of innovation, how can we solve the problem? And then this idea of, let's see how we can change the system, because the system is what's kind of failing. And there are different players within the system, but how do we actually try and change this system? And we've gotten to a point, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but we've gotten to a point where we've actually spent a lot of time in the building and the doing, and now we're kind of looking at, okay, so how do we change the system, like more in depth? How do we work in community? How do we deliver place-based support? So they're the kind of questions we're having now. We never stop asking questions, but I think that's a good thing. And so when we built for purpose, we made some really deliberate choices that embedded purpose at the very setup. So our constitution talks about our mission. It talks about us being a social enterprise. It is locked in. It's sitting in our constitution. So was really important for us that the mission was embedded in the constitution. We have a majority founder ownership, and we are all aligned to the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And I think that is really important. So Umbo started with 3 co-founders. We all have various roles within the business now, but the social outcome and the purpose we're trying to achieve has always been the North Star for all of us. We have really clear design principles, so we don't compromise on team culture, and we will always have a client-first approach, and Jeannie will talk to that a little bit more. We were clear on what we wanted to achieve, and we had some boundaries on growth and funding choices, and I'm going to talk about those also, because that's actually really impactful. There is a huge temptation when you are starting to go, oh yeah, I'll take that money. Oh yeah, I'll take that money from grants and funding. But sometimes it's actually not a great way to be, because you actually deliver programs and services that don't meet your mission. And Umbo was in an incredibly fortunate position to actually secure investment from a very purpose-aligned investor. And we were very fortunate in that way. And we've had a great relationship that's ongoing with that investor. But we had to put some boundaries in around those choices. The other thing is the culture of Umbo. And we talk about culture a lot at Umbo, and we have always worked from a values-driven way of hiring our team. So we currently have 45 therapists and about 20 kind of head office staff. All of us are in alignment with our Umbo values and how that we want to work, and with the purpose. And so we always try and understand the why. The first question we ask in any interview is, why Umbo? Why social enterprise? Why are you interested in what we do? Because it's really important for us to know that people are on the same page as us. And how we can connect that role. And this is something that we need to kind of continue to ask ourselves: how do we make sure that everybody knows they have a huge part to play in us achieving our mission? It's not just us. It's not just the exec team, it's not just our head office team, it's every single person across the organisation. So on that note, I just want to kind of really get everyone to have a little think about how important it is for you to design a social enterprise around an unmet need and that purpose. These are some of the questions that we ask ourselves a lot. And so I think it's good if we can share kind of the way that we ask the questions, you might gather something out of it. So yeah, please take the time to think about, that unmet need for me is really crucial. I think that's what I've found has been really crucial, but also having that North Star and that purpose all the time. I'm going to hand over to Jeannie now, who's going to talk about how we measure and maintain our purpose.
Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here. As Francesca said, I'm the clinical services manager, and I'm going to chat a little bit today about how we measure and maintain our purpose and how important that measurement is to ensuring that we are aligned with our purpose. How far we've progressed in finessing that skill, and where we're sort of sitting now and what we're looking to do next in terms of measurement. Okay, so this is, I guess, a framework, if you like, for the way we measure. This was set up at the very beginning of Umbo, and there are bits and pieces that have changed and bits and pieces that perhaps we need to change now. We're at a point where we need to reflect back and change. One of the key things which we prioritise at Umbo because it aligns with our mission is that measuring outcomes are more important than outputs. Yes, we measure our outputs. We want to know what the activity of the business is and how that's running. But to ensure that we're working towards or meeting our social mission, we measure outcomes and we recognise and prioritise the measurement of those outcomes in our business. And what I would argue now is there are some things, some of the outcomes we measure really, really well at Umbo. So, for example, we have therapy outcome measures. We use a tool called the OzTOMS that measures our clinical outcomes for our clients. And that is really solid, robust data. And we use that to frame our decisions and support what we're doing and identify where we are meeting our need. But overall, our outcome measures at this point in time are much more about our individual outcomes. They're individualized. We haven't yet, or I think it's probably we're at the time where we really want to expand our collective output measures. Our collective outcome measures, and have a broader understanding of the large impact that Umbo is potentially having, and how we're serving our mission in a greater way. One of the reasons we popped our theory of change in here is to show you how the business has changed, where we've started, how we're refining things, what we're developing, and where we're heading to next, and how that these ideas, particularly this theory of change here, has served us well, but it's not actually necessarily exactly as things are now. So I guess just to sort of highlight that idea of development and change. So this was constructed early in Umbo's journey, and a lot has changed because we've grown and developed significantly, even in the 4.5 years since I've been here. When I started, I think there was one other speechy and 2 OTs and me. And now there's 40 clinicians and 20 head office crew. So things have changed quite rapidly in 4.5 years. So some of the elements on this theory of change are relevant, but some of them have not developed in the way perhaps as we would have initially anticipated. So for example, we've got on there develop evidence-based training content. We do have some evidence-based training content that we use internally, but the idea of developing a broader range of external training content, we haven't really developed that in the way we had initially thought. So now this theory of change it's up for review. It's a really good time in Umbo for us to sit back and reflect and ask the deep questions about measurement and change and update our documentation to support that. So what do we measure and how do we measure our impact currently and what do we know? So one of the things we do at Umbo is we have access pricing. So just to give you a little bit of background about that, Umbo reinvests 50% of their profits back into our access pricing scheme or our fund. And we use that money to provide financially accessible or subsidised therapy and assessments for clients who could not access those services otherwise. It's usually nearly always not 100% subsidy, but it's a sliding scale. So we take into account our clients' financial and geographical vulnerability, again, holding, set that mission to our core, our central being, to provide subsidies so that we can provide as much equitable access as possible. I mentioned before briefly, we measure client outcomes. So I talked a little bit about the OzTOMS, and our data from that shows that our clients are gaining significant improvement, and the longer the therapy duration, the more significant the improvement is. We also do get feedback from our clients, and we've maintained a 4.9 out of 5 quality feedback rating, which is fabulous. So we collect quite a lot of data about individualized clinical outcomes at this point in time. We also measure our geographical input, our geographical impact, sorry. So 71% of our clients come from regional or rural areas, which is something we're incredibly proud of because it shows us we're really meeting that geographical need. We're reaching the people we were set up to reach. The impact of doing that is that we're saving 33 hours of travel time per client, which is huge, not just from the NDIS funding, which you can see a dollar figure there, but also day-to-day living. Not having to travel 2 hours with all your children to go and access therapy and then 2 hours back again makes a huge difference to someone's life. And we've delivered 117,666 direct therapy sessions, which is a fabulous figure. I'm very proud of that, so I'm a little biased. I take that on board.
And that may have gone up in the last couple of weeks. So
Yeah.
definitely, yeah, we deliver on average 2,000 therapy appointments each month. It ranges depending on the month, but yeah, so it's a huge impact. And I think the other thing, sorry, Jeannie, to jump in, but I think the other thing I'd be really keen to kind of understand and explore and hear any kind of guidance and advice from anyone, you know, who's across this area is we've calculated from the very get-go, or, you know, particularly from a certain time, how much money by delivering our therapy online, as Jeannie said, we have saved in NDIS funding because travel charges are really high within NDIS funding, and also they are often a barrier for people to accessing support. And the NDIS has most recently changed in their last price guide around how people can claim travel. It's capped now. So the question for me is, you know, we've calculated we've saved nearly $30 million that would have otherwise been spent in an NDIS across NDIS budgets by providing the therapy online, because that would have been spent on purely on travel, not on therapy delivery, because that's budgeted and paid for separately. I kind of want to shout this from the rooftops, but it's kind of like we feel like sometimes we're shouting into a void. And it's because this is a great model that you can not only support clients, but you can actually save money from a government scheme. So I'm really open to any ideas, suggestions around how we can advocate for greater uptake of online therapy in this with this kind of model across Australia, or how do we promote it? How do we support it? But actually, like, I'd love to get in front of some of the powers or people that be, because $30 million is, you know, it is a very large scheme, but that's nothing to be kind of, you know, quiet about, I don't think. So yeah, open to any ideas, suggestions that anyone might have, because yeah, we want to use the information, the data that we're gathering to start to advocate further. Hit us up on LinkedIn if you've got some ideas or connections.
That'd be great.
Thanks. Sorry to jump in there, Jeannie. Back to you.
Fine. Thank you. So I sort of touched on this a little bit at the beginning. We have got some great ways of measuring our outcomes at the moment, but we're now at a point where we really need to step back and think about, are we actually asking the right questions about the way we measure our impact? Because we do want to get a really good sense of our broader impact as well as our individual impact. And how do we understand volume and depth of impact? So as Francesca mentioned, we now do 2,000 sessions per month. I think that's extraordinary. But is that having the impact we intended it to have on those communities and on those people? Are we making the depth of difference that we want to make as a social enterprise? So I'd love anyone's thoughts on that. And now I'm going to hand over to Sam, who's going to talk to you about our journey from startup to strategic business.
Thank you. Okay. So if I'm going to pop onto this lovely slide here. So I think this graph on the left-hand side, it's a really lovely way to express the startup journey and just how lumpy it is. You know, and I love having a axis where it's your happiness curve. I think it's also your energy curve of, you know, everything starts off and it's fantastic and you're all keen. And at some point it becomes really tough. You know, the depth of how tough it's going to be depends on what's happening with yourselves, but sometimes it can be really tough and it can be tough for quite a while. I think The transition to become a strategic business is how you deal with those tough times. So you see here we've talked about experimenting and pivoting. How many ups and downs you have will depend on your skill sets. It depends on your luck. It depends on the environment that you're in at the time. It's not always something that you can predict or manage. Um, but the idea is that you do have to persevere and keep the time on that and eventually find out what works. So that's looking at what product you're providing and the market that you're going to be operating in. Definitely in Umbo, once we hit that match, then things became big quickly. I think it's fair to say. Um, I'm sure some organizations have a lovely environment where quite quickly you can work it out, but I think it's good to sort of see this and say, life never goes to plan the way you expect because you obviously don't know what you're doing before you do it. Um, Now, one thing with Umbo is that, this whole transition that we've been on, I can see everything was just so fast-paced and reactive at the start. And it's just that constant having to deal with things as they arise and not knowing what you're going to be dealing with until it pops up in front of your face saying, this is the next thing that you need to manage to get to where you need to be. It definitely requires that experimental culture because to find what works, you've got to be prepared to take a risk and just have lots of different ideas about how you can get to where you need to be. Once you do end up having that great fit, then you can move into more of a structured and scalable organization, and then you can start looking to the future. I do think it's important to look at this and go, when you're experimenting, you're not necessarily looking at long-term success, but you do need to get there eventually if you're looking to be an organization that continues to have impact. So this slide will talk about the different attributes of a startup versus a strategic business. And I think often if you'll contemplate the difference, you might say it's quite hard to define. But if we talk about some of these, you'll see that they're actually very different attributes. So the first one is your organizational goal. So to begin with, it's about finding what fit you've got. And that can be changing what your product is, what markets you work in. But by the time you've moved into a strategic business, you've got scale, you've got your goal, and then it's about optimizing that. Same with revenues at the beginning. You'd really expect it to be unpredictable, unlikely to be making money, often burning through whatever reserves of cash that you've got. To be strategic, that obviously needs to change in the long term. And also, your revenue needs to be predictable. It doesn't necessarily have to be, the same every month, but you've got to have a fair idea of what's going to happen, and it has to be sustainable. Now, with your structure, most startups, they're very informal. You'll have a couple of people on board. You're all decision makers. And it's a very open structure. As you grow and bring more people on board, you're going to have a defined hierarchy, and you're going to have to bring more people on board. When you bring more people on board, decisions change, the way that you do things change, and it becomes a little bit more of a traditional structure. Again, with your decision making at the start, whoever's involved is making decisions, and it's really about making them when you need to do it to get on. As soon as you've got more people on board, your founders can't do everything. And I like that idea of recognizing when you've got to start delegating things. But you've still got to have confidence about who else is being involved. Are you making the same decisions? Can you have confidence others are going to make the same decisions? At Umbo, a lot of our decisions are data driven. That provides a lot of consistency, but it also helps us really understand of how to make a decision without somebody telling you what to do. Now, one thing I've really noticed and been, I think, really pleasantly surprised about Umbo is our processes are so strong. A lot of small organizations to begin with, your processes are pretty ad hoc, maybe a little bit loose. And it's because you do need to change. And if you're changing every day, you can't be documenting things. But eventually, when you do want to grow, you do have to have some standardization about what you're doing. When you want to provide quality services and products, they've got to be consistent. You've got to be able to repeat them. You've got to be able to manage things like staff turnover, making sure that the next person can do a process to the same standard. And that it's the difference between providing a bit of individual nuance, but still providing the same structure as what you would have, say, for example, 12 months ago. Now, previously, Francesca was talking a lot about culture, and I like the idea that you can almost have two elements to culture: the culture that remains the same and the culture that needs to change. So definitely with startups, you have that constant hustle of I can grab everything, I can do everything at once, I can pivot. Next half hour, I'm doing something completely different to now, and you've got to have that flexibility. Becoming a strategic business is how do you maintain the positives of that, but make it larger? So when you bring more staff on board, everybody's got accountability while still maintaining flexibility. You've got to lose some of the hustle if more people are sharing the tasks involved. But you do need to have that alignment. And I think it's really about sharing the feelings of your founders and having everybody on board with those feelings going forward. And then the last thing to talk about, risk level, which is always a favorite of mine. I think when you have a startup, you've got to have a high risk environment. You don't know exactly what you're doing, and with that becomes risk. You don't necessarily know how it's going to turn out. And of course, some things they don't work. You've really got to take the risk to work out what does work. Otherwise, you're going to get stuck in a bit of a grey zone where you're not achieving what you want to achieve or grow to where you want to grow. But long term, risk needs to be managed. And it's that level of you're always going to take risks. Risk is required to grow a business, but at some point, your risk attitude needs to minimize a little bit. And I think it's really about having a better understanding of what your risks are, how you're managing them, so that the risks that you do take are strategic. You're taking a risk in the environment that you want to, and you've got a better understanding of the potential outcomes. Definitely when you begin with, you won't necessarily know the outcomes of the risks that you're taking. But as you grow bigger, you should have a fair idea, and then you can focus on the things that are important for you. For Umbo, how do we know that we're more than a startup? Now, I think for me, it was really looking at that previous slide and just going, you've got such clarity when you go through those different areas of the business. But I'll go through these different areas as well. So for our clear service market fit. Now at Umbo, we know how to support our clients, and we know that we do a great job. We've got consistent revenue and cash flow. That doesn't mean that our revenues are the same every month, but it does mean that we can predict what our revenues are going to be. And we can do it in a timely enough manner that if things change, we've got the ability to do something about it. Our cash flow is consistent enough that we know we can pay our bills. We can know if we've got something that we want to do in 12 months, we've got a rough idea if we've got the cash there. And I think that's one thing is really important to focus on when you're growing an organization, is that if you don't have cash, then you're not going to make it. And sometimes these are really hard things to manage, but you have to know what you don't know, and you have to know the parameters of what's coming in and what's going out, particularly as you're growing. A lot of organizations will fail at that growth stage, not because they're not awesome, but they just run out of money in the short term. So we've also got very defined roles and teams. So our structure is that our therapists are based in hubs. And we've got 5 hubs at the moment, and that means that they can have some really tight-knit teams. Even whilst we're all online, it does give them the ability to have colleagues that they can talk to on a regular basis. And we know that our teams, they've got their own autonomy and accountability. The other side of things is our back office roles. And for us, I think we're definitely in that in between stage of we've developed more back office roles. We definitely don't have all of the expertise in-house that you'll find a really large organization has. And I think the process of creating roles is a really challenging one. Like when do you need HR? When do you need marketing? When do you need finance? Um, when do you need it external? When do you bring it in? Uh, we're constantly on that role. And we have these discussions about, do we want to bring in this role? But what would that mean? Where's the cash flow of that? And what else does it impact? Now, our systems and processes, we've got very strong systems and processes. Being an online organization, we've got a very high usage of systems, and with that comes the processes so that we're all using systems in the same way. Working within the NDIS, you do have an awful lot of requirements about how you do things and making sure that we've got consistency in how we do them. I was incredibly impressed when I started at Umbo, the induction planning for an organization that still feels small. We've spent a lot of time focusing on making sure that everybody understands how we do things together, what we can do and have flexibility on, but what it's really important to have consistency on. Now, I'm sure over the years, Francesca's talked a lot about the co-founders, our 3 co-founders, and the work that they've done. And they've done everything to begin with. And for a very long time, they were the leaders of the organization. But to grow, eventually, you do need a larger leadership team. And I can see it of the point of 3 people can't do everything, and however many founders you've got in your organization, you're going to reach that critical point where you could work 20 hours a week and you're still not going to be able to do everything. So at some point, you have to bring others on, and particularly at that senior level to help you with your journey. Whatever the expertise of your founders are going to be, you'll have areas that aren't covered. So initially, a lot of organizations, they will look at externally to bring that in, using consultants, particularly using volunteers sometimes when you can get them. But there's nothing quite the same as having your internal leadership. So Jeannie and I will always know more about the organization than what an external person can, because we're living and breathing it all the time. That also means that the decisions that we're making, we are able to do things like consider more aspects because we're all bringing our professional backgrounds to us. We're able to make decisions with considering more outcomes. And we're able to challenge each other as well, which is always really lovely when you can say, this is amazing what we're doing, but my little area of expertise, I can ask questions about what we're doing and the outcome is going to be greater because we're all considering each other's skill set. Here at Umbo, we do still have quite a focus on long-term strategy. And I think it's an interesting thing of how do you know when you're getting bigger, what does long-term look like? So at the end of last year, we had a strategy day. And for us, it was developing a 3 to 5 year plan. Now, that's not going to give us the detail of what we're going to do next week, but it was looking at what we've achieved, what from the last strategy day that we had, where we want to go, and then having some really great, robust conversation about, does this meet with our mission? If this is what we said before, is it a variation to it? And making sure that everybody in your leadership team and on your board are on the same page about what your long term looks like and the reasons why. And if there's any conversations about it, you should be having it years before you actually do it. The conversations are not to be had when you've created a 6-month budget and then you've popped a new project in there, but nobody's considered the long-term way of how to get there and also how to continue on. And then another one of my favorites in finance is talking about governance and accountability. Now, I feel really quite passionately about governance because that's how you deal with the things that you don't expect to come along. That's how you grow without taking risks. That's how you don't compromise everybody's integrity about what you're doing. Also the accountability of the outcomes of the decisions that we make, knowing, for example, here we've got, for example, an NDIS audit coming up soon. I know that this is going to be a great audit. I'm sure there are organizations out there that it would freak them out. But knowing that we've got all of this underlying governance, it's a process we follow, but we've already dealt with the initial process of it. It's not about dealing with it when you've got an audit and suddenly saying, oh my goodness, now we need to backtrack and cover everything that we didn't consider. At Umbo, we're very strong on considering things before we do them, and then you can embed whatever you need to do as you go.
I will just touch briefly on this. This is a really interesting article from Stanford Social Innovation Review that I found very helpful when we were discussing scale. And it's a really good way to have a look at your organization and really think about what are the elements that you need in place before you actually start to scale your business. The image on the right with Waterfall Promised Land, they're kind of basically ways that you can almost pop your organization into an area and look at it and kind of go, is this the right time or the right way that we need to scale? So it's more just a reference if anyone is kind of in that phase where you're looking at growth and how do you kind of build your organization. This can be a really good way to ask yourself really interesting questions. And are we ready to kind of scale, and have we got kind of that right to scale? So now what I'd like to just share is around purpose-aligned growth. And Athanasia asked a question in the chat around looking at some of the things we've said no to, and I am going to touch on them, I promise, and some of the areas where we just really made bad decisions, because of course we did. But I think this is, purpose-aligned growth. And the reason I put this aeroplane is, and we talk about it all the time. So when we were first in that startup phase, we would have a daily stand-up every single day. Anyone in the exec team, we would make decisions on the fly. It was very fast-paced. And we talked about how we built the plane as we flew it. And I would still say there's an element of that, but the key thing for me was we built the plane as we flew it, but we always knew the destination. And I think that's really key because we knew what we were trying to achieve. And we went through however many different routes and whatever it looks like. But at the end of the day, we could always come back and say, what we are trying to do is this. And so I think this idea of the hustle culture, the kind of fast decision making, it's super important in that phase. But it's kind of like, what is the outcome you're trying to achieve? And also, what are the really important questions you need to ask yourself when you're making those decisions? And just going back to what Sam said around that culture, that chasing from hustle, it's a really hard transition for a lot of people. A lot of people love the startup phase. And I don't know whether it kind of aligns fully with me. I did really enjoy it, but I'm very process oriented. And so it could often be hard for me. I was often the handbrake of, oh, do you think we should do this? Do you think we should do that? And, but that's why you need a really interesting team so that you have all the different elements. So the people who are like, come on, let's just give it a go. That's always been really interesting. But I think coming back to within your organization, having some really key questions for yourself when you're making these types of decisions. So the question we would often grapple with is, does making this decision help us live our mission more deeply, or is it just going to help us grow? That's a question a lot about funding, I think, as well. And so I'll touch on it on the next slide. But we, as I said, we had investment into Umbo, but we made a conscious decision to stop applying for grants for a very long time. We have received 2 grants over the last 7 years, both within the last kind of 18 months. And that's because we felt that the grants were almost like a distraction for us. Sure, I'm preaching to the converted here. Lots of people would have done grant applications that are for $20,000 that take you 20,000 hours to complete the application. And then you're building a program that really doesn't hit your mission potentially. There's a lot of that, I know, but also they can obviously help fund a lot of organizations. But for us being a social enterprise, we knew that the business could actually sustain us. So that was the question. Does this help us live our mission more deeply, or are we just going to grow faster? Are we aligned with the why that we set Umbo up the way that we did? Is saying yes to this going to compromise our trust with the community or team? So we actually had a grant. We put in for a grant. We didn't end up utilising the grant for a central Western New South Wales very early on. And it was a very short, intensive program. And there was a question about if we come in and we run this assessment program and whatever else, but then cannot deliver a sustained outcome for that community. And then the $20,000 that it was is taken away and we walk away. Have we just broken the trust with that community? It's a really important question, and it's something I think that we have to be really conscious of all the time. And so what were we willing to walk away from, even if the money looked good? Now, I'm not saying we had money thrown at us, so let's not, get too excited, but there were definitely some things that we did. So here are some of the trade-offs that we went through. We get asked quite often, could we deliver therapy in person? Can you just come to my house and deliver that therapy? Could you send a team out here for this? And we have made it very, very specific. We will only do online therapy. And there's a multitude of reasons for that. One of the largest reasons is all of our systems and processes are built on only doing things online. It would change our complete way of governing from a clinical governance perspective, that it would be quite different. But we also wanted to hold true to, we want to serve communities in locations that are hard to reach. And if we deliver things online, are we doing that? Because do we have therapists who are available to go to, the Pilbara? We don't necessarily. So that was one of the key questions. We talked very early on, and we actually started to look at investing into a software platform. And then it was probably about 2 years of lots of discussions, lots of time spent. So, time that could have been spent on other things, looking at building our own software platform. And then we kind of worked out that the things that were on the market were fine and that we could use them and that they have the requirements that we need. We spent some time looking at PR. How do we grow the knowledge about Umbo? How do we grow the information about our team and our founders? But when we went back to it, we actually wanted to spend the money on client acquisition. And if we could not directly link the PR to acquiring clients, then at that point in time, it wasn't the right move. We were better spent putting our money on advertising, for example. This is just a time now where I think we could kind of review that. So I think now that we've got information, knowledge, and also a lot more of a story behind us, a story from our team, a story from our clients, a story from the communities we work with, PR, I think, is maybe more important now. I really wanted to spend money and make us a training provider so that we could not only share the knowledge, but it was a revenue stream for us when we first started. And that was back when online therapy was definitely a bit of a barrier for a lot of people, and a lot of therapists were asking for training. But the cost to set that up, the impact on the focus of us delivering a really good service, this was actually a really hard one for me to grapple with, because right at the start, when we had no money, we got offered a fairly decent amount of money by an organisation to deliver training, but we weren't going to achieve the outcomes we needed to achieve. Plus it was going to be a big distraction. So we had to say no. And this is where I had one hat on and everybody else had the other hat on. And we had a lot of discussions about this. So our focus was on doing service delivery and doing it well. And that was a hard decision for me. No grant applications, too time consuming, too little return, like I said, until we got a grant from the Snow Foundation last year, which was only for access pricing. It was $75,000 to help fund our clients in need. And that for me is the sweet spot of grant funding for us, because it meets our mission. It's in line with what we do. And it is supporting and creating a great community with a philanthropic organisation to help us support our clients. So that was a type of grant that we were really keen. But grants to do things that are outside of our service delivery, it's not that we're completely opposed to it, but I would never want to start something purely for that purpose, to meet the need of a grant. And then speech and OT only. At that point in time, one of the trade-offs was we don't have the capacity to put other disciplines in. So there were definitely some hard decisions and some ways forward that, some of us may have loved, some of us may not have loved, but there are definitely trade-offs in order to build the business to where we are. And there's definitely, you will spend money on things that later on you don't kind of utilize. It's kind of the way that it is. So I am just going to ask Jeannie and Sam to just provide a quick reflection about where they've seen some of the biggest tensions, because I think that tension between mission and money in a social enterprise is really valid. You want to create more revenue, but you also want to meet your mission. Then can there be a tension between that? So I might throw to Jeannie first.
Yeah, thanks, Francesca. We've sort of talked a little bit about growth and how we went through quite a rapid growth period. And that was a priority for us because we saw it as meeting our mission, as in it would expand our ability to reach the people we wanted to provide services to. And we grew, the way we scaled or the way we grew was we replicated the hub. And Sam talked a little bit about that our structure is made up of, I guess, small clinical teams of about 10 to 14 clinicians. They're managed by a practice manager and a team leader, and we call them a hub. And so instead of making the hubs bigger, we replicated our hubs. And we were going along beautifully, and our hubs were doing a fantastic job providing great services. And so we continued on. And we got to Hub 5 and we launched into Hub 6, and it was a step too far. We didn't have what we needed for that hub to be viable. We didn't at that point in time have the client load coming in quickly enough. It was difficult to get the clinicians. It was difficult to get that hub sustainable. And then we realized that the cost of trying to acquire clients at that point in time was more than we had anticipated. And it's almost became a perfect storm. A few of these things all started to happen. And we went, this is just not viable. We can't do this at this point in time. So we had to step back. And at that point in time, we had clinicians working in Hub 6. We had a Hub 6 team leader. And so we had to then turn around and have conversations with people that we really valued because they brought so much to our organisation around what is this going to look like for you? What can we do? How can we support you? Because we actually cannot facilitate our 6th hub. And fortunately, as time progressed, we were able to reabsorb those people, which was great. And they in our business today providing fantastic support to our clients and to our mission. But it was really a very difficult time. They were incredibly tough conversations and very personal conversations. We really value the people that work with us because they provide an incredible skill set and they serve such great purpose. And we want people to feel connected and love where they work. And I think we all feel that way. So then to turn around and say to someone, we might not be able to have you work here in the way we'd originally said, or potentially not at all, was really challenging and really difficult.
Thanks, Jeannie.
Thanks, Jenny. So I find being in a social enterprise, it's like the sweet spot between where you sit with mission and money. Like often in a not-for-profit, mission comes first, and if you're in a corporate, money comes first. And I think we're kind of in this nice space where we can say they're both important. And in Umbo, we've got, such a strong culture about both of those things being important and knowing that your mission can't come at the expense of the bottom line. Now, I love the clash that creates because as a finance person, I'm always quite conservative. It's always about having a bit more backup money and a bit more cash just in case and not taking too many risks and just being really careful. So I love being able to have the really strong conversations about saying what wins out today, what wins out next week, what's a really lovely compromise where we prioritize mission, but we have some guardrails in place about saying this is how far we'll extend ourselves before things become risky. I like to be in that room and be part of those conversations. And I like it when people challenge some of my conservatism and say, that's great, but maybe that's a step too far. I think the tension creates the better outcomes. If nobody's asking or challenging in the process, then you haven't considered everything. I'd say for me, from being here, some of those decisions we've been talking about how much we pay people and having a real review of that. And there's been some really honest and hard conversations about when you want to value everybody, you want to value your clients, you want to value your staff, you want to value your commitment to the mission. But where's the hierarchy? And I think that's hardest when you're really push come to shove of saying, what is the hierarchy? But how does everybody still feel valued? And I would say I don't have the answer to all of that by any extent, but it's shown just how challenging it is when you've got the internal, external conflict.
Thanks, Sam. I think yeah, it's something that we just grapple with, I think, but I love that you love the tension because I think that brings really robust conversations, and that's what we should be having, really robust conversations. So, on reflection for us, some of those kind of tensions, we just kind of come back to some core principles, purpose-driven decisions, making sure that we have value-based decision making, so long-term impact over short-term gains. Access pricing for us is a bit of a trade-off. We know that we are going to consciously subsidise clients, and it's a deliberate choice for us. It's not just a budget line. And so that's really important. And then saying no to misaligned partners. So making sure that if we have to, we can walk away from partnerships that don't align with us, because we don't want to compromise just to grow. So that mission integrity really feels non-negotiable to us. So I guess what we kind of set up is some guardrails. So some of the structures and the policies and processes that will protect the purpose, especially when things get tough or growth gets tempting. And so for us, some of the things are, we have a pricing cap with the NDIS. And that means that we charge our private clients the same price as our NDIS clients. So we want to make sure that it is affordable as to what, I guess, the government aligns it as affordable. And this prevents that bit of mission drift, because I think mission drift and mission creep is really a challenge and something you've always kind of got to keep your eye on. The MMM2 is a way to measure kind of regionality across Australia. And so for us, it's always keeping our eye on that. What is the regional, rural and remote areas that we are servicing, and are we keeping our eye and making sure that within those guardrails we've got the underserved communities at the forefront? We want to make sure we're an NDIS registered provider. We actually don't have to be an NDIS registered provider for the majority of our clients. We only have a very small number of clients that make us require the NDIS registration. It's about the funding way that we do it. But actually, it's very important to us to maintain compliance, even though going through the audit process is very challenging and very expensive, partly because it's a sustainability question. It's also a credibility question. But as I tell myself as we're going through the audit, this is good for us as a business because it's good governance and it's good accountability. But it's you've got to keep reminding yourself of that. But we will always make sure that we are NDIS registered. And like we've talked about, we hire based on values alignment. The culture add is almost more important than the culture fit. We can have someone fit to our culture, but actually, what are you going to bring to the table for us? And what can we bring to the table for you? It's super important that we have that culture, and that our team members are not just driving performance, but they're really driving the purpose for us. And so reflecting on that, if anyone has time to kind of think about it, what are some of the guardrails you have introduced or could introduce, or that you have already done in your organization? Because they are super important. And it's almost really important to kind of to name them so that everybody knows what are the things, where can we bend and flex, but what are those things that make sure that, we're in the right parameters of decision making. I hope that being able to kind of reflect on the Umbo experience, how we built Umbo. One of the things that it just kind of triggered when Sam was talking before and mentioned a little bit about luck. I have a podcast that I really love called How I Built This with Guy Raz, and his last question is, how much do you think it was good luck and how much was kind of hard work. And I often think about that question for Umbo because I think, the majority of it was hard work, but there was some good luck, or maybe it was good timing. I'm not quite sure, luck and timing, but, we were facing huge barriers around people understanding online therapy. And then there was a shift in, I guess, social acceptance of delivering things online. We had some brilliant people come into Umbo at the right time, and they just were there for the purpose of helping us grow and understand our business. Luck, hard work, I don't know, fortune, whatever it could be, but there was definitely kind of, different little pieces there. We received the investment that helped us to be able to, at that very specific time with those very specific people, grow and actually expand our growth. And so I think that was, really interesting. So yeah, the question of luck and hard work, I find, a really good one to sometimes kind of sit and reflect on. And maybe it changes on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. But I think it's a good one. So it's something else to kind of reflect on as well. We'd really love to hear any questions that you might have. I just also want to, express a lot of gratitude to the Social Enterprise Australia team. We've really loved getting this presentation together, but also really loved, being able to share, our experience and what we've learned. So, immense gratitude to you for this. But one of the questions that was asked pre-workshop was around, did Umbo ever consider a work integrated social enterprise model? And I think this is a really interesting question that actually leaned right into the stuff that we were talking about today. So for me, I kind of was thinking about this last night, and the question of mission, our mission was to provide services to people who are underserved. And a work integrated social enterprise's mission is to provide employment services to people. And so if we were to run a business like that, it would be outside of our mission, and it's not the mission that we are aiming for. So when I was kind of reflecting on this question last night, we actually have incredibly our model, because all of our therapists work from home, actually supports quite a number of therapists who actually can't work outside of their home due to disability or other kind of caring responsibilities. So actually we do support a lot of people in a different type of work environment, but we haven't set ourselves up specifically as a work integrated social enterprise because that's not what we're here for. So I think it's kind of was an interesting question to kind of sit and go, oh yeah, oh no, okay, let's go back to mission. What are we here for? This is a purpose. But we actually have a byproduct of supporting people who actually are marginalised in their work environment, and we can actually support them in that way.
Thank you, Oscar. You can ask a bit more about access pricing. Was there anything in particular you wanted to know about it, or just some more general overview as to how we use it? Just a general overview, sure. Okay. So access pricing works within the business, within the context of the business. So when people come to us, when we have clients come to us, if anyone gets a sense that someone is going to find accessing our services difficult because of their financial situation, then everyone across the business has the right and the responsibility to flag that. And so when that happens, we put forward what we call an access pricing case, and then Francesca contacts the client and works through a framework with them and discusses what we can do to support them and provide accessibility, not just for one session, but for the sessions that they would clinically need to serve their goals, essentially. And that access pricing decision is made, as I sort of mentioned briefly before, on a sliding scale. It fits around financial vulnerability and also geographical vulnerability, so that we make sure we're prioritising our mission, prioritising serving people in regional and remote Australia. We set up an initial sort of understanding, like perhaps we'll offer sessions for 50% of the price for X amount of time. And it's not that once that's finished, that's the end of it. That is a period of review. And if we can provide, if continuing those services is going to meet a client's clinical needs, then we absolutely will do it.
I might just add to that a tiny bit. One of the kind of benefits of being able to provide the subsidised services, I'm not sure, how many people are aware, but at this point in time, in order to access NDIS funding and put an application in, it's a hugely costly process, and part of it is to have what's called a functional capacity assessment. So they typically take about 15 hours of a therapist's time, which is around $3,000. So if you are financially vulnerable, not only that, you may have had a pediatrician report and a whole other lot of information. And then you require a functional assessment. And so we see huge value in being able to subsidise that, because if we can then get people to access the NDIS, then they have funding access and they can get a much better service. So the long-term impact is really a lot higher. And so just by being able to subsidise that one component, we can't subsidise much else. But if we can just at least get people over that financial hurdle. And so we actually ask the question after someone has had an assessment with us. About 8 weeks later, we ask, how has this benefited you in your attempt to access the NDIS? Sometimes it's, it really has supported people and it was kind of like the missing piece. For some people, it can come back to the NDIS decision, but we know that what we've tried to do is have a far greater impact than just that one piece. And I think that's really important to us as well.
And I would probably just add one other little sideway to that, is because this is such an important part of our business, we looked at how we were going to measure it and how we were going to keep up to date with what we were doing. I think it's important when you have such an integral part of your business is you work out in advance, how do we know how much money we've got in there? How do we know how much we've spent? And have some good discussions around, well, this is what our internal resource is right now. This is what we're capable of. This is what's easy. And coming up with some really simple structures to answer the questions that you're going to be asking regularly about this. So for us, we have our social impact fund in a separate bank account. I can open up the bank account and I know exactly what's in it. It takes me 5 seconds. It doesn't take away from doing the other work, knowing that that's something that we're going to want to know all the time.
Thank you.
Francesca, we had one more quick question that we might have time for from Sonia. It's 2030. What does your impact slide say?
Fantastic question.
Oh my gosh. 2030 is not that far away either. So that's the scary part. When we went through our strategic planning recently, we really talked about how can we deepen that impact and what does it look like in communities. And for us, it's really about how do we support families in community. And so for me, one of the key things is not only expanding our services across different allied health disciplines. So we're looking at psychology, introducing psychology, and how, because there's such a high need in that space as well, how do we deepen the impact for people in communities by promoting and supporting people working in that community. So allied health assistants currently live and work in communities but need support from a therapist. And so how do we become that conduit into a community to widen that impact and build the capacity? So for me, that's part of what hopefully 2030 will tell us. We've started to test the waters. We've got some great partners in regional communities. But part of the impact will be that. But really, the North Star in 2030 will still be the same for Umbo in supporting and underserved and regional communities across Australia. And I think that's kind of the key for us, is that piece won't change. And so that's what's really important. Thank you.
Wonderful. Francesca, Jeannie, Sam, thank you so much. This was a beautifully interactive, reflective, real, lived, genuine and useful session, a real learning session. Really appreciate it. I was scribbling through the whole way. I was really interested to see the deliberate choices at startup to set a really good base. Loved your phrase, the outcomes more important than outputs. And that sort of really focus on asking the right questions. Why? What are we trying to measure here, and how does that link to our mission? And your decision framing questions, because it's so easy to be taken down a path and go with it, and that real honesty around trade-offs, because we're all really passionate. And it's hard to let go of the things that you love and feel like are really important. So I appreciated those. I wanted to thank everyone else for joining and for your comments and for your interactions today. Huge thanks to the Department of Social Services for supporting the development of these learning communities as part of the Social Enterprise Development Initiative. to the Social Enterprise Australia team who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to get them up and running. Thank you again, everyone. Have a super day, super month, whenever you're listening, and we look forward to seeing you again.